This podcast is a part of the Garnett Media Group podcast network. Garnett Media Group is the official partnership between student-run media outlets at the University of South Carolina. For more information on GMG podcasts or other student work, visit garnettmedia.org. Hi, my name is Dr. Jabari Evans, and welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, the podcast where we talk about all things spanning race and representation within mass media. This podcast is a partnership between the School of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of South Carolina and Garnett Media Group. So without further ado, let's get into this week's episode.
So I was also a Teacher of the Year in 2017, which I am very proud of. So that's the graduating senior class. They pick a professor who, they don't do this structure anymore, but they all write down a professor's name. I wasn't even teaching that semester, but that was also the spring after the 2016 election, right? So I wasn't teaching that semester. And it's one of those moments where I'm like, that means the kids who left my class were still thinking about my class and wrote and voluntarily wrote my name down as an open-ended thing. It wasn't like, here's a list of professors and pick one. No, it was open-ended, which professor is still sticking with you. And so I was on leave that semester, and like I went to, and it was a surprise. It was very much a surprise because I frequently complain that, I'm not going to win any teaching awards for helping the students realize how they're a little bit racist. Like nobody wants to talk about that. And then everybody's mad at me because I said the thing. And as opposed to being mad at racism, they're mad at you for talking about racism. And so, I then recently won a citation of excellence from the chancellor something. I don't know. It's on my website. I don't know what the title is, for coordinating a program for freshmen to get them to talk about diversity early and often, and also getting our professors to be ready to talk about these things. Because the thing about teaching diversity is that it's rhetorically siloed, but widely applicable. So if you talk to any diversity scholar, we can talk about advertising or film or news or sports or anything, because diversity issues are across everything. But then people who talk about these sub areas don't have to talk about diversity because we have a diversity expert, right? So the diversity gets kind of siloed into these responsibilities. But ultimately, and this is the statement I always make, is that our students will only be as good as the professors. So if the professors are not ready, willing, and able to talk about diversity, and you don't have to be an expert, but you have to not be scared about it. So, you only have to be as open to the conversation as the students are, right? Or you only have to be as educated as the students are, but more open, let's put it that way. So really just trying to get our faculty to kind of sample, play with in a very structured manner, how to talk about diversity, very low stakes. Like you're not teaching the class, you're just talking to 15, 18-year-olds about these things and using the key terms. So I recently won that award, which was very cool. And then multiple of my teaching lessons, strategies, modules, whatever, have been awarded great ideas for teaching at NCA and ICA.
Do you think that there's been like a shift? Because I know like there was the whole like Come So White thing that occurred at both NCA and ICA as pre-conferences. And like, I know that was at a time where I was literally entering into the professoriate. So I was like, okay, well, I mean, I'm entering into it having life experience and another career and all these other things. So I think I had an understanding of just where the world was. But academia even seems even further behind than that, right? And so do you ever feel as though this work that you've done while getting awarded is often like what Black scholars are saddled with in the discipline?
Well, I'll tell you this. I will have accomplished my life goals, professionally speaking. Let me rephrase that. Definitely not. I will have accomplished my teaching life goals. If at some point, somewhere down the line, one of these 1,500 students raises their hand while sitting at a decision-making table and says, I think my professor might call this racist, could we think about it a little bit harder before we click go?
Yeah.
That's pretty much all I'm asking for, right? Like, so I think as simultaneously frustrating as it is to teach theory to professional students, right? So none of my students have, there are some double majors, but very few of my students do comm theory, do comm research. They're all journalism, advertising, PR, you know, they're practitioner students.
Yep.
So that was its own beast. And this is what I would recommend to your grads. And so as I was saying, you know, if you're immersed in this conversation, like, and you know it in and out, and you're talking to your advisors and your committee, and they're all just like, oh, you got to think about this, that, and the, like, you're immersed in a bubble of wokeness. I love it. Love it. Embrace it. Know that when you go to teach these classes, those students will not have that same, oh yeah, let's talk more attitude. And I realized this when I came here, like, I've never experienced, so, you know, I only grew up in cities. Syracuse is the smallest town I've ever lived in, not counting like living in Sault Ste. Guyana, but in the States, like, it's the smallest town I've ever lived in. And I've never, and also more homogenous students. So I had taught at USC in LA and Loyola Marymount, also in LA, which is a small liberal arts college. Expensive, but small liberal arts. I had never encountered students where I was like, hey, so here's something that's racist, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, no, it's not. And I'm like, well, it is racist because, you know, it has all these disparate impacts, and like kind of pushing back on not wanting to talk about it. That was in 2013 or so when I started 2014. I feel like in the past 10 years, students are more willing to say, oh, is it racist? I didn't know that. But it also comes down to how you frame the argument. So for me, like, racist is not a noun, it's an adjective. It describes something. It describes an act. It describes a language. It describes a policy. And if something is racist, then it, according to SCOTUS and legal precedent, it has a disparate impact by race. Or it perpetuates racial disparities, sexism, gender disparities, you know, classism, class disparities, just impute different social categories here. And so I start the whole class with that. I'm not interested in what offends you, because honestly, I grew up on 1980s Comedy Central, okay? Like, it takes a lot to offend me. Yeah. Having said that, I don't need to be offended to see how this policy, the words of this person, you know, this kind of, this media content perpetuates the dehumanization of people based on insert social category here. Yes. So when you lay that out from the very beginning, like, you don't need to be offended to understand that this thing is problematic. I'm actually not really interested in whether or not you're offended. I'm interested in whether or not you see how this thing today connects to all these other things from the past and thereby prevents us from moving forward in the future. And so I find that my students are more aware that shit is racist. I don't know if you cuss on your podcast. I cuss all the time.
Oh yeah, no, you're good.
Okay,
Good.
I like,
it provides a little seasoning. That's
yeah. Spicy language. It's the SpongeBob episode where they like start there's spicy language and spicy words. And there's also some research that shows that people who curse are perceived as more honest. So that's cool. But yeah, like, I'm not interested in whether or not you're emotionally affected by this material. If you're not emotionally affected, that's a different issue. Maybe you have a little sociopathy, but you don't need to be emotionally affected. You just need to be able to see that we are at the intersection of the past and the future. And if you don't want to see the past, then you won't be able to affect the future.
Right. No, I'm wondering about something you said before we even got on, or before I pressed record rather, which is this idea that students don't read, which was, you know, it's something that I've said off record tons of times, but to hear someone else say it kind of made me feel better about that proclamation. I guess I'm wondering though, is that a symptom of a generation, or is that just the way things have been and no one has just talked about it? Um,
I think that it is both a symptom. I think it's both. And I'll say this because, you know, if you were in college in 2000,
right.
there was just this expectation that you were doing this reading and cramming all this reading. Like we would get whole books and you had to
Yep.
read it in the first 3 weeks of the semester because there was going to be
Yep.
another book that came on in week 4, right? And you had to stand up and talk about it.
Yep.
I find that, and this is pre-COVID now, students, the students that I teach, so again, I teach practitioners, I teach professional students, they are overwhelmed with the content they need to create. So the reading, well, I'll just catch up on it later. It's just not important because I have all these other things to do. I have all these other things I want to do. All right.
And they say that to you. They'll say it to you in the email.
Outright. I didn't have the time to do this. But this is one moment. And so it's both, that they would rather be doing all these other things. The truth is they read a lot. They read a lot of stuff on Twitter. There was some math about like, if you calculate how many tweets you read, that's the length over like a week is a whole book, so like it's absurd number of texts because we're in a very text-based society. We text each other, we read tweets, we're moving a bit more towards the TikToks and the Instagrams and the visual communication, but all of those still have captions and people are still reading all of it. So they're clearly reading, they're just not reading in long form.
Right.
They're reading in short bursts, which is a different type of reading that professors are not familiar with because we are generationally distanced from them. So one moment I had, and this poor student, I don't remember their name, so I would go ahead and throw them under the bus. But I remember being in a class and I said, who read the paper? And like class of 30 students, 3 people raised their hand. So they were willing to say they didn't read it right off the bat. This is why I've changed my whole structure. And so I said, okay, one student read it. Okay, what was the essay about? It was like a 10-page essay, maybe?
Right.
What was it about? I don't remember. Okay, well, what did you take away from it? I don't remember. Well, give me any piece that you remember from these 10 pages that you said you read. I don't remember. And I'm like, okay, first of all, you just wasted your own time. Like you read 10 pages. I believe you read it. I believe that. I also believe that you retained nothing from it, which says to me that, which also says to me, you don't know how to read. You don't know how to read. On top of that, they're reading online, and I don't know how many of them mark up their PDFs or whether they just scan it. When I was in college, you had the highlighter. Like I pull out my old textbook and I show them my old books. It's highlighted, it's marked up. We didn't return our books unless, you absolutely had to. But in the end, you get $5 for a $100 book. The book is worth infinitely more than fancy coffee. So it wasn't a good deal to turn your books back in.
Right.
So you just marked them up and kept them. So that's when I realized, like, it's not just that students don't read. And they don't read long form, but they also don't know how to read. So I had to and theory again, right? Like they'll read case studies and they'll read the stuff that's like in bullet points.
Yes.
But how do you get them to read bell hooks? How do you get them to read Stuart Hall? How do you get, and like all of these things are fundamental, foundational stuff.
Right.
That, and of course, and the students are like, oh, well, this is old. I'm like, no, this is foundational. So you need to read this and then connect it to something from yesterday. Like that's the task.
Yeah.
So I've gotten really specific on my prompts, which are share a quote. Number 1, pick a quote, go in there, find a quote that resonates with you. Start there.
Right.
Number 2, why did that quote resonate with you? Why did you choose it? Number 3, how does that quote help you explain or put words to something that you looked at yesterday or last week or whatever, some recent artifact that you're engaging with?
Right.
So then I also make that, because like I can't keep up to date on all the shit they watch. Dude, I don't even, they're like, this YouTuber. I'm like, dude, the only thing I use YouTube for is like cat videos. Like I can't. So when they do that also, they bring in, and I'm like, include links. They bring in their content and then we can talk. And then I learn more about, Andrew Tate and Shameless and Euphoria
Right.
through their interpretations of it. And
Mhm.
then we can have bigger conversations. So that's coming back, the very long answer to do students read? They definitely read.
Mhm.
Quantitatively, they are reading.
Yep.
They don't know how to read,
Mm.
and they don't know how to retain from long form reading. And so I've also taken out all my tests. I don't care. I don't want to grade your stuff. I don't want you to turn in a paper because then I got to grade your grammar. I don't want any of that. I just
Mm.
want you to show me every day that you took something from this longer piece and connected it to something new. And then I give them credit for that.
Mm.
Um, and in doing so, like, we have juicier conversations. Um, and I've gotten rid of, write a term paper. Like that sucks. And they don't want to do it. And that
Right.
breeds a lot of AI cheating because there's like, oh, turn
Yeah.
out this paper. I'm like, no,
Yeah.
I want you to tell me a quote you saw
Right.
and, then connect it. That's how you read.
That's amazing. No, I think I'm taking notes mentally even with that because I know that like, coming into South Carolina, my title is literally assistant professor of race and media. So immediately, to your point, like when there's a discussion about, oh, we need something in sports media that thinks to race, Jabari, what do you think of that? Or how can you, in some ways, shape a syllabus for that? Even if I'm
Right.
not teaching it, it's like you're in the meeting about it. How is it gonna be implemented? And I think, more and more, I've had to get away from my own training. And I think I don't know if we're the exact same age, but we definitely were in college at the same time because I was definitely of that era where you had to go to the campus copy center, get these big binders that
Yep.
are full of articles, and then on top of that, go to the bookstore and get the textbook. And so there was an understanding that there was going to be pre-reading and you were going to come in having read certain amounts of things and definitely highlighting things and folding pages. And, sometimes we shared books because it was helpful sometimes to see other people's notes in the
Sure.
same book. But it certainly wasn't a situation where you had a clean, a
Definitely
clean
not.
slate. um,
So I'll pull this one out. And I don't know if you do visuals, but that's not the one I want. The one I want. So I actually have my background is a nice picture of my own office.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then, so yeah, it looks like I'm in my office. Let me see if I don't know if I can remove anyway, no matter. Okay, so just really briefly. So this is the book that the students use, their intro textbook, Media and Culture by Campbell.
hmm
They're on the 13th edition. This
hmm
is the second edition from when I took the class, Intro Com, in 2000 at Westchester Community College. So then I also remind them, I'm like, the book it's not special to you, okay? Like I
right.
took this class at Westchester Community College, and then I like bust out all my highlighting and I show them like all the marked up stuff in the book,
Mm,
and remind them, I'm like, you need to learn how to read and write and take notes. And so that has been a key part of just learning to work with theory, learning to work with larger socioeconomic texts, like not socioeconomic, but larger socio-political theory and texts, and get it down to today.
mm,
Um, so yeah, that's my go-to is pick a quote. Don't just tell me you read it. Pick a quote,
right.
pick two quotes. Tell me why they resonated with you. Tell me how they connected to the larger article, and tell me how they connect to something from yesterday.
That's amazing. I mean, I like that. It's almost like it feels to me almost like those little brownie bites that I
Yeah.
continue to eat, and they turn into a full brownie. But like it's that small piece that lets me know that you get
Yeah.
it.
And so then
um,
when I do the bell hooks, like I pull out my marked up, I don't know if you can see like all my little
yes, I see the
notes and
highlights and
highlights
the
and
yep.
stuff. I'm like, that's what makes reading fun.
Yeah,
At
they
the same,
used
oh,
to deep reading as they called it,
deep. And
close
I'll also say one of the
reading.
other things, like I don't test what I was saying, what I wanted to say before I forgot was, they don't have exams. I'm like, you don't have to read this stuff to memorize it. You're not being tested on it. I want you to read it the way you read your favorite book. I want you to binge my lectures the way you binge television on Netflix. Like, I just need you to systematically engage with everything and show me you systematically engage with everything. You get an A, that's it. But like, I think the value in learning this stuff is literally being exposed to it. And so I've quantified exposure. And if you expose yourself to 135 hours of content, 90% of 135 hours of content, you get an A.
That's real. That's real. I mean, you talked about like the shift from the textbook through editions, but I'm thinking now about like this idea of like what race even means within the media. I think in the early 2000s, largely that conversation was around representation, and like what does that mean to, or even diversity from more of a just a representational point of view. Um, I'm wondering how you view how representation matters in this era, particularly regarding Black folks, and like whether there's a such thing as a model representation, or whether we're just searching more so for nuance in how Blackness is represented. I'm thinking primarily here on television and film, and how then do you go about either writing about that or teaching it even?
Sure. Well, my adage, and I say this all the time to anyone who will listen,
Hmm.
is no single representation is a good representation.
Okay.
The only good representation is a multitude of representations, period. So if I ask you, what's a good representation of a white man? You can't really come up with one because you've got a dozen on the tip of your tongue, right? You've got everything from the president in the West Wing to, King of Queens to Modern Family to Leave It to Beaver to, like, you've got white men, you see them in, they're rich, they're poor, they're fat, they're skinny, they're tall, they're short, they're measured, and they're also like wild and crazy. They're the hero, they're the villain, all these things. So you cannot come up with a good representation of a white man because they don't have to. They have so many representations that they can have good and bad ones, and they live together.
Right.
We are so obsessed. We are still very much in a token mentality. We're like, is this one representation a good representation of a Black person, of a Black woman, let's say? The answer is always no. The answer is always going to be yes for someone and no for someone else, period. Yeah. And so there's no way to have a good representation if you only have one representation. And so that is my argument, is we are still very much tied to a token ideology. We only get one. And so that one better be good. And you're like, or hear me out on this, we get three. One is good, one is bad, and one is just fucking weird. Now we're talking about robust representation here. And that's what I love about, say, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, right? You've got two Latinas that are diametrically opposed. You've got the goody two-shoes and you've got the renegade. I can wait for this siren. Can you hear the sirens?
No, I can't hear them.
Okay, cool. You've got Terry Crews, you've got Andrew Braher, right? Andre Braher. So you've got like super heterosexual, 4 kids, manly man, and then the gay dude who's in power, right? The gay police chief. You see the differences of Blackness. You see in Black men. You see the differences in Latinas. You see the differences in the 4 other white dudes. You've got Andy Samberg and then like the 2 other kind of lackey dudes that are just kind of funny. You see differences inside of one show. You can't get that if you only have one person representing a given group. So right off the bat, I always say no representation is a good representation. No single representation is a good representation. The only good representation is a multitude of representations. So if you only have one, is not good, period. It can't be good. And then that gets into what is your definition of good, right? Is it respectable, right? So we had the Cosbys and people said that was good, but then there's, I think, Herman Gray has some literature showing that, watching the Cosby Show for white folks was associated with post-racial attitudes, right? Black folks have made it. Racism isn't that big of a problem anymore. And there's another study from 2016. It was like, if you get primed with Oprah, Obama, these other like prominent, accomplished Black folk, you're like, oh, if they can make it, why can't you? That's a you problem. So it's clear that we need a multitude to showcase the spectrum within a given group. That's one point. My another point, and I will also connect that to the American Dream Project. So I do want to take some time to talk about makeamericadream.com, Make America Dream More Dreams.
Yes.
And that's very much, when we talk about the American Dream, we have this kind of cookie cutter structure, but very few people fit into that cookie cutter structure. And the only way to have a better understanding of the American Dream is to dream more dreams. Like we have to see rich dreams, poor dreams, white dreams, Black dreams, gay dreams, straight dreams, disabled dreams, right? Like all of these things, we need dreams. We need to see more dreams so we can understand the diversity of humanity.
Yes.
And with respect to representation, the other key point I wanted to make was so I often get asked, what does Kamala Harris mean for Black girls? What does Barack Obama mean for Black children? What is representation of Black Panther mean for Black kids? And I'm like, what that answer is. The answer is they see themselves on screen and they're super excited and it helps foster self-esteem and belonging. Cool. You know that answer. Stop asking me that question. The question I want to answer is, what does Barack Obama, Kamala Harris, and Black Panther mean for white children? What does it mean for non-Black children? Because right now we have a generation of kids who know that a Black person can be president.
Yeah.
And that is diametrically opposed to everyone who came before 2008, right? There was, you talk to anyone, it's like a Black person can't be president. We're still in it with women. A woman can't be president, right? When we have a woman president, know that every single generation after that person will know, women can be president. It's not that big of a deal, right? Black Panthers showed white kids or Asian kids, non-Black kids, that Black people could be superheroes. And I say this specifically as an Afro-Asian Caribbean woman, right? So when he was the descendant of immigrants, when I see Kamala Harris on stage, like I see me at like at a very intersectional level. But more importantly, my white appearing boy child sees her too. And that for me, personally, rhetorically, scholarly, is more valuable to talk about. And again, I don't want to dismiss the value of seeing yourself on screen. That was my whole dissertation. Happy to talk about it. But like, I want to move forward with what representation, because in the end, if a bunch of white folks don't think a Black person can be president, then a Black person won't be president. It's that simple. Black folks know Black people can be president. Black folks know Black leaders. They know Black doctors. They know Black teachers.
Sure do.
But I need white people to know that Black people can do these things. Because if you don't get, they're still the majority, we're not in 2040. If they don't think it's possible, then it won't happen. And that's why I think representation is so important. We have to change the mindset of the out group. We also change the mindset of the in group. Internalized sexism, internalized homophobia, internalized racism is a real thing. But at an institutional structural level, if you don't change the attitudes of the out group, nothing will move forward. We're all just watching, Black TV and hoping that we feel good. But I need change in I need change in the halls of power. And that comes from out group members thinking that we belong in halls of power.
That's real. I mean, now that I'm getting to the crux of, even learning about your experience at your institution, very similarly here at South Carolina, I'm teaching kids who are primarily entering thinking I'm going to be a journalist, or I'm going to be, a broadcast journalist. I'm going to be an anchor, or I'm going to be in advertising, or I'm going to be in PR. It's very practitioner focused. But even those professions, and to be a practitioner in those fields, is no longer linear like it once was. And yes, it was hard even in the late 90s, early 2000s, to get an internship and then figure out your way up. But I'm finding more and more that students are bloggers, streamers, podcasters, some have their own businesses already. Some are, finding themselves consulting or just doing things independently. How
Everybody's got a
has
side hustle.
Yeah, how is that, then also shaped this conversation around like representation where like folks when I'm in class and I'm like, well, what is it that you're watching? And they're telling me, oh, I watch Castanet or I'm watching DJ Academics and I know these people, but I'm like, that's not necessarily who I expected, right? Like when they're telling me that they don't even own a television and everything is on the iPad, and so it's all kind of competing with one another. Like how is that then in turn impacted the way in which you approach these issues of race, gender, and class as it pertains to the media? Like, what is mass media in this day and age?
So I generally don't worry about that.
Okay.
For me, my argument is it's everywhere. Diversity is everywhere, even if you don't think you're watching it, right? And this is so in the home college experience, I always encourage students to see, how is race represented? Oh, well, race isn't represented because all white folks. I'm like, what'd you say? Say that back again? Race isn't represented because it's all white folks. Let's unpack that statement, right? So like understand like what is classism? Well, there's no classism because there's no discussion of lower income people. I'm like, oh, okay, so you watch all wealthy people. What's the class discussion there, right? So like I don't really care what you're watching because whatever you're watching, I can make it about this. And I need you to be able to make it about this by doing the reading. So, I think one of the things, the way we talk about diversity is very much rooted in, oh, well, when Black people are on screen, then it's about diversity. Or when, if it's a woman movie, it's a movie starring women, well, then it's about sexism. I'm like, dude, we went and watched Transformers, the new Transformers, because I have a 6-year-old, and I did not check the rating. It is PG.
Okay.
And it's just, if I could just take a minute. Keegan-Michael Key as Bumblebee, very enjoyable. And he's got this bit where he's like, yeah, my name is B275 or whatever, but I'm trying to give myself this nickname. It's Badassatron. But it's pronounced Badassatron.
Yeah.
My child died laughing, right? Now we have to explain him what badass means. And so I don't remember how I got into that. But again, so there's Scarlett Johansson. It's Chris Hemsworth, Brian Tyree Henry, Keegan-Michael Key, and Scarlett Johansson. And Scarlett Johansson somehow is the girl robot. She's pink. She's got boobs, kind of like this weird breastplate thing. I don't know why we need to gender robots.
Emphasize that.
Yeah. And then John Hamm is also in it. And Lawrence Fishburne, FYI. And as his character's on screen, I'm like, that's Lawrence Fishburne. And he's playing this whole like Morpheus thing too. It's great. I love it. But again, so there's one girl robot. And if you're a girl, you're supposed to like the girl robot. We spend a lot of time watching like Paw Patrol, right? Oh, if you're a girl, you have to like Sky because she has a pink helicopter. Oh, we're going to introduce the snowmobile husky, I forget what her name was, right? And this idea that you have to like this one, here's your one token. Is Sky a good representation of female dogs? Is Scarlett Johansson a good representation of female robots? The point is that it might not be about gender, but I promise you there's gender there because what's the line I use? Hold on, let me get this right. Because I put it in a thing. Everything has to do with diversity because reality is filtered through the lens of humans and humans are diverse. So, also coming out of a STEM school, it's like, oh, well, math doesn't have to do with diversity. I'm like, of course it does. Like, if it doesn't have to do with diversity, then I shouldn't see a strikingly low percentage of Black people in the area of math and physics. So there's clearly something happening here that's keeping them out. Now, there's 20 different points in the line where it could be, all of which deserve time and energy. But like, don't turn around and tell me it has nothing to do with race if you are not on par with the national averages. So like, I'm currently in this project on the racial wealth gap with some folks from the IVMF, which is the Institute for Veteran and Military Families.
Okay.
Right, and talking about like the racial wealth gap and opportunities through military, et cetera. Military is one of, especially rank and file military, is one of the few, if not one of the only industries where employees are on par with the national percentages. So 15 to 20% of enlisted military, Black, 6 to 10% Asian, 15 to 20% Latino, right? Like those are the national averages. Now we can definitely talk about military and socioeconomic status and how they're pulling from, a specific strata versus officers who are usually from a different strata going through ROTC and college, etc. But like, don't tell me that your area has nothing to do with diversity if I can see the disparities in your population. So it has to do with diversity. You just don't want to talk about it, which means nothing's going to change. Oh, and if I could just go real fucking, what's the word I want? Soapboxy about this.
Go on riff.
All the students want to talk about progress. All the students want to talk about progress. So I'm like, here's the history of how we represented Black people from, 1619 to 2019, right?
Sure.
Here it is. But what about the progress we've made? And I'm like, look, dude, you can get anybody to talk about progress because everyone wants to say that they're better now than they were before. Right. And I think this became clear with the new enrollment numbers in the wake of the SCOTUS affirmative action case. If we have a scaffolding and I pull that scaffolding out, if all the numbers fall back to the floor, have we made progress? Or did we just put Band-Aids in place so we couldn't see how we were failing to correct the damage?
Yep.
Right? So I would argue that that's not progress. We could say progress, looks like, like you're less likely to say NIGGR than your grandparents. Okay,
Right.
That's definitely progress. That's cool. And we don't say it on TV anymore. That's good.
Yeah.
But like, I don't see any change in numbers. I want to see quantitative progress. I don't want to see, I feel like we're progressing. I have a Black friend and my parents didn't have a Black friend. Great. How are we actually helping that Black friend or that low-income friend or that queer friend overcome the boundaries that everybody has put into place? Progress is institutional, not individual, in my opinion. Obviously, individual progress has its place and it's very important. Cut this out, but I will say it. I referred to, don't put this in it. But okay, I'll clean it up so you can put it in. I have a family member who I refer to as a recovering homophobe. He has not said anything terrible in like 15 years. Progress. At the same time, that's within the home space. That doesn't necessarily mean, and even when we see like marriage equality 2015, now they're trying to pull the rug on that. So like, what progress have we made if the progress is not longstanding? What is progress? And I think that's whenever the student's like, I want to talk about progress. I'm like, well, I want to talk about lack of progress, and I'm the teacher. So go talk about progress with your other, folks who say that we are post-racial or whatever. Good luck with that.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, your work has delved into satire greatly. And I think that's an interesting realm in terms of even just piggybacking off of this idea of progress, where sometimes it has to get muddy in order for it to move forward. And folks have, talked about like how satire walks this fine line between humor and harm. But what do you think about like some of the great, I guess, satirists of our time in terms of like folks like a Chappelle, folks like a Chris Rock or people like that, and how, it seems like even in this period of like political correctness that they've been able to like really tell some truth, like some very ugly truths in ways that open people's eyes to just what's going on in the world. And sometimes they take a lot of hits for that, but ultimately it's conversations that they're sort of bringing to the forefront that are moving things forward. So what do you think about like the ethical responsibilities of satire when it comes to like race, gender, sexuality, class, and so on?
So first of all, I would ask you this question, and you don't have to answer it, but what
Okay.
is satire?
I mean, for me, I guess it is sort of taking what reality is around us and sort of, I guess similarly to when I talk about parody, I guess it's almost instead of taking like an actual work and reinterpreting that work, it's almost a reinterpretation of life. I guess that's sort of my take on it, is like what we see around us in our everyday society, and then figuring out a way to sort of I guess reinterpret that from a humorous lens, but it's almost like so over the top that it's so over the top that it's obvious, like it's low hanging fruit.
So I will say that this is part of the problem with
Okay.
whether or not we can even talk about how satire works and what are the ethical expectations. Because I spend a lot of time in my second book on diversity and satire, talking about the ethical obligations of satirists. But it's really important to note that when we talk about satire, everybody comes up with their examples, but they don't actually define it. It's important to note that satire doesn't have to be funny. It does not have to be funny. Humor is like secondary to this whole thing. It's
Okay.
funny because it's asking you to see the absurdity in reality. So I define satire as the use of humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule. Humor is only one of those four things. To expose and criticize social and individual absurdity or something that is ridiculous or wildly unreasonable. So right from the bat, it has to be that you're pointing out, and you had that piece, or you acknowledge that piece, that it has to be talking about something that's happening in reality, right? That's so absurd that we can only kind of satirize it by highlighting it.
Right.
But one of my favorite examples is the 2016 fake cover of the Boston Globe, which they put on the top of the op-ed page. And they postulated if Donald Trump could do everything he says he's going to do, this is what the front page will look like 1 year from today. And so the big headline is deportations to begin. Market sinks as trade war looms. U.S. soldiers refuse orders to kill ISIS families. New libel law targets absolute scum in the press, right? That's not funny. There's nothing about this thing that's funny, but it's cringy and it hurts because you're forced to realize this is the reality of what one of two presidential candidates, one of the candidates in our two primary two parties system thinks, and if we implement it, that's what's going to happen. There is nothing funny about this page, but it is a perfect example of satire because it's showing you the words that he's saying are absurd. This is how it will happen if we believe him. And so humor doesn't have to be with it. And I will say that, especially when we think of satire as comedy, then we push back on things that make us cringe, right? We push back on things that make us hurt. And so but cringe for me is a very important response to satire because when you cringe, you know that there's something real that's happening, that this person is speaking to that you don't want to acknowledge. Wow. So in the other one, there's one where, let's see here. I think I have, hold on. Larry Wilmore at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So on Obama's comedic monologue, Wilmore says, "Stay in your lane, man. You don't see me going around all presidenting all the time, right? I don't go around passing health care and signing executive orders, pardoning turkeys, not closing Guantanamo." Oh, wait, maybe I did do that, right? And like people groaned. The other one, hanging out with two-time NBA MVP Steph Curry, quote, "It kind of makes sense too, because both of you like raining down bombs on people from long distances, right?" Groan, like the audience groaned. He made the audience cringe or experience a visceral reaction to something embarrassing or awkward. He acknowledged this in the moment where he said, "Groans are good. Groans are good. That means you hear me. You understand what I'm talking about." And so right off the bat, I would argue that a satirist has an obligation to recognize the past and speak to the past. Like you can't just, and this is the issue if we come back to Dave Chappelle, right? I use a lot of Dave Chappelle examples because his race satire, chef's kiss, brilliant, amazing. Black white supremacist, Clayton Bigsby, Brilliant. Drop that in the pilot. Having said that, his co-writer, whose name I'm blanking on now. Neil Brennan, right? Like all of that stuff was written with a white co-writer. It's the Chappelle Show, but know that they're talking together. And I also talk about Brennan's response to White Like Me, watching Eddie Murphy's satire on Black Like Me in 1984, right? So if you don't know that Black Like Me is a book, then you don't get what's happening with White Like Me. Okay. But Brennan said explicitly that was the first time I ever realized, oh, being Black is a totally different experience than being white, right? That is the power of satire. Look at this thing you don't see. Look at it! Right? Having said that, Dave Chappelle's gender satire has always been bad. It's always been bad. You go back and look at any of those episodes when he tries to take on and satirize the experience of women, it's just really misogynistic every time. And just making jokes at the expense of women. So when he went into his trans bits, and I usually say bits when I talk about trans as genitals, right? Everybody needs to know what your bits are. But when he goes into his trans bits, like, he's completely detaching it from the discrimination that trans people experience. It's completely detached from the fact they are more likely to lose their jobs. They are less likely to get healthcare. They are more likely to be ostracized by their families, right? Like, all of these things are true, but you don't want to talk about it. You have, if you, at this point, you're not a satirist, you're just a comedian, right? Like Gallagher, Carrot Top. We don't consider them satirists. They just make us laugh by smashing a watermelon, which is hilarious. Don't get me wrong. But like, we don't go there to expect them to show us the reality, the absurdity of reality. Dave Chappelle was the satirist. He won the Mark Twain Award. And when he gets defined as a satirist, then as far as he's concerned, anything he makes is satire. But it's clear that you are not pointing out the absurdity of reality. You're pointing out the absurdity of what it means to be in a privileged position and now having that privileged position questioned. And you're responding with anger, right? And so, like I said, his gender stuff has always been bad. Always been bad. Like, you can go back to and again, I was raised on 80s and 90s Comedy Central. You go back to his stand-up routines. Anytime he's talking about women, he's talking about TNA. He's talking about how he can take advantage and like what women give him. So it's clear he has, from his position as a man, is incapable of seeing, as a cis man, is incapable of seeing the absurdities facing women, trans folks, non-conforming people, anybody who's not a cis man. He can't see that. And so it shows up in his satire because he is not critiquing the absurdity of reality. He's getting you to laugh at people who are suffering.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I think about that literally in one specific week in my race, gender, class, and the media course where, I just kind of use his trans bit as just as a prompt to sort of, I guess, wake people up almost because I think sometimes people think that certain things don't even belong in the classroom, or they're surprised that they can be in the classroom. But it's amazing how you can do one thing really well and be tone deaf in a completely different light.
You know who else suffers from that? I use a lot of Amy Schumer examples. Amy Schumer's gender stuff, brilliant. Little white, very white feminist, but when she's like, she won an Emmy, or the songwriters won an Emmy for the song, I forget what it is. I've got it written in here as well. But yeah, like when her gender satire, she's got some stuff on rape culture that I use, like really good. She starts opening her mouth to talk about race, and it's just a complete dumpster fire, right? Like, complete, to the point where it's like, okay, so you understand your situation as a woman, white woman, you understand your situation as a woman, but you don't see how you're perpetuating. So what is the line? She's like, she's got one routine where she's like, I used to date Latino men, but now I prefer consensual. Right. And and she thinks it's funny. while simultaneously associating Latino men, men of color in general, as rapists. And then lo and behold, that fits into Trump saying Mexicans are rapists, right? Like, you need to connect all these dots. I will say that, yeah, let me see if I can get the quote right for you. Hold on here. Historian. To ascertain if media is satire or mocking, one must determine if the content encourages critical thinking about power structures. The satirist must understand that the systems of power against which they are pushing back and how these systems have led to the treatment or mistreatment of certain groups across time. The satirist must be a historian first and a satirist second. Jokes without historical awareness should not be considered satire because they are not intentionally speaking to historical processes. Conversely, I'll just finish the paragraph. Conversely, jokes that merely reinforce historical disparities and continue to oppress already disadvantaged are simply cruel. So the ethical obligations for a satirist is literally know your history. Like, you have to be a historian first before you can be a satirist. And Chappelle's gender stuff, and I mean that with cisgender women, I mean that with trans folks, with non-binary folks, his gender stuff is woefully detached from the long history of gender oppression.
Yeah. No, as you're talking, I'm making like the sort of like the metaphor in my mind of like, a basketball player who's wildly good at shooting a three, but cannot hit a mid-range to save his life, or cannot play defense, or it's like the level of care, the ethics of care, as Andre Brock tells me, ethics of care, what you put into one thing, and then the lack thereof that you put into another thing can be almost jarring. But I think in this space of like Hollywood and fame and so on and so forth, often people get, let off the hook because they're so great at that other thing, or they have that track record for doing that other thing for so long, particularly from a standpoint of a person of color. It's like, oh, well, I'm absolved. I can be wrong in that space, I can't.
And we see that with white women all the time. I can't be racist because I'm a woman. You're like, yo, those are not the same thing, first of all. And you can totally be racist if you're marginalized race, because racism is about perpetuating disparities. But like, that tells me you don't actually understand what racism is, yeah, this sort of, oh, well, I'm oppressed over here, so I couldn't be doing the oppressing. You're like, nah, when you say you're not doing the oppressing, you're probably doing the oppressing.
Yeah.
I will say that I frequently say, like, when I had one student ask, he's like, how do you push back when somebody's called you racist? And my immediate response was, why do you need to push back? Right? If somebody says something you did or said is racist, my answer is always, because I get this all the time, right? People are like, oh, you're racist, you're sexist, whatever. I'm like, yeah, probably. Like, probably this thing you said was racist. Yeah, probably. Let's talk more about that. Like, the desire, coming back to progress. How do I prove that I'm not racist? I'm like, I don't know. I'm pretty certain that anything you try to do is only going to make you look more racist. Like, here's my Black friend. Here's what I've done for a marginalized community. No, the answer should always be, and I tell my students this, three things. Oops, or oh shit. Oh shit, number one. Number two, my bad, or I'm sorry. Number three, tell me more. Or I hear you, or I didn't know, I need to read up more on that. Like, just acknowledging what the person is saying instead of having that knee-jerk reaction will buy you so much goodwill. So if Chappelle was like, hey, that joke you made was transphobic, and he said, oh shit, my bad. Really? Oh, let me look up more on that. We would have a completely different conversation. But he was like, I don't want to engage. He's like, I will meet with them, but you have to admit that this other comedian isn't funny. Like, he really took on I'm not transphobic. I have a trans friend. Never mind the fact that they suicided. I have a trans friend, so I'm not transphobic. You're the transphobe for telling me that my jokes are transphobic. And like, got into this whole you know, twisting himself into pretzels, which only made the whole affair worse. You know, he wanted to double down because he is the greatest satirist of all time.
Wow.
And therefore, any critique of his what he claims to be satire, and I think I talk about this in so let's see here. Let me just see real quick. Dave Chappelle was sharply critiqued for his jokes, page 181, at the expense of trans people. However, Chappelle's routine did not appear to evolve. Instead, he increasingly targeted a contingent of his audience by dismissing and mocking their concerns. When he was accused of punching down, he replied, "Punching down? What the fuck does that mean?" By you don't understand. This is what I said in class. Cognitive consistency is not a human strength. It's not a human strength. We reserve one cognitive process over here for these people and one over here for these people. So he's like, you understand how people punching down on blackness, you get that. You've been making fun of that for 20 years. But now all of a sudden people you're punching down on trans folks, you're like, I don't even know what that means.
If I can't do that. I have a friend.
Right. But if you're a satirist and somebody accuses you of punching down, first of all, you know what punching down means. Right. Second of all, instead of saying, let me see how that works out. This, I think, is the nature of being a professor. And I say this all the time, going through a PhD will remind you that you don't know squat outside of your area. You don't know squat. You don't know. And we see other people, I have a whole opinion on Steven Pinker. He taught my intro psych class. It was, anyway, whatever. But this is my area of expertise, and I'm just going to go ahead and dabble in all these other things and make all these claims about it. That's not PhD training. That's I wrote pop press books and now this other thing. But you know how it is. You know very well what you don't know. And what you know is this tiny little narrow thing, and you know it so well. Mm-hmm. But then you talk to other people and there's just no training or engagement with maybe you don't know everything. Maybe. Because if you think you know everything, you're going to open your mouth and say things that are wildly wrong. And then when people tell you they're wrong, instead of saying, let me go read more, your response is, I'm not wrong, you're wrong. And so that's just the human tendency. But I would hope that satirists whose goal in life is to showcase the absurdity of human tendencies would recognize their own human tendencies and how they are absurd. Bars.
Oh man, this has been amazing. I'm thank you for your time, and this conversation from the jump has been a mind bender in a good way. I have two things that I wanted to ask you before we get out of here, and they're a little bit more lighthearted.
And I will say that my 12 o'clock lunch canceled on me, so you good.
Okay.
But I do need to dip in 15.
No worries. These are more softballs than curveballs. One, I wanted to ask you about podcasting because I think that's something that you've done in a way that I admire in terms of your ability to sort of do creative scholarship that is both subversive as well as provocative, but still very critical. I wanted to get your thoughts about how, this is something I talked as well with a colleague of ours, Ginger Eye, who's at NYU, was at Rutgers prior to, but storytelling and podcasting as a viable means of scholarship. I wanted to get your take on that. And then the last thing I wanted to ask you is just sort of what you're consuming what you're consuming media wise and what is bringing you joy in this time.
So I'll just talk about podcasting. I will say I am not a good podcaster. I think I'm a great conversationist, and we just kind of record these conversations, and I'm a good professor. So I started podcasting primarily because I was going to teach a class. So Robert Thompson at Syracuse, total rock star, media critical studies person. We were going to start a class, a diversity class using Fast and Furious, so that the required viewing would be Fast and Furious, and then talking about representations of race, class, and gender in that series, which I think is rife. I think it's exciting. they're coming from lower working classes, and we see how they are dismissed by the general population because they are street criminals and street racers. It is one of the only majority minority, that is to say majority non-white casts with a $1 billion franchise, billion, like billions plural, global franchise. And that is something in and of itself. And then on top of that, we went to go see Five, I think, with my then boyfriend, now husband. And he goes, you know what I like? I like that the women could drive. And I was like, I was angry at first. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's right. It's so brilliant. They're not damsels in distress. They are out there behind the wheel. They don't need to be taught how to drive. I love that opening. The first time when Brian goes out with Mia on a date in the first one, and she's like, you want to go for a drive? And she takes him on the ride of his life. Like, it is incredibly disruptive at every level. And so we were going to turn that into a class. And then we didn't get our shit together in time. So we turned it into a podcast, right? So we just break down so if you wanted to take a class on Fast and Furious through the lens of race, class, gender, and media history with Professors Charisse L'Pree and Bob Thompson of Newhouse, you can go to criticalandcurious.com. And so that's what it was. It was really just a class in an accessible format of audio engagement. Then we really wanted to do then we wanted to keep going. Once it was over, once we were done with episodes, we're like, we want to do more. So then we did a case study of Keanu Reeves. And so literally 30 Keanu Reeves films across 30 years, everything from My Own Private Idaho to John Wick, and really talk about his representations of race and masculinity, both from an international and a domestic perspective, because he is technically Lebanese, Hawaiian, Canadian. Chinese, Hawaiian, born in Lebanon, French Canadian mother, right? And so, yeah, we did a whole deep star study. So really taking the star study methodology and bringing it to every single chapter in that thing, for which there's like 12 or 13 chapters. And then the third one was looking at Romeo and Juliet. So really all of these seasons could be a class, and we just don't have time to put it all together. So we have a conversation. I think one of the key things that keeps podcasting from being officially academically recognized is the lack of editing. By which I mean to say, and that's not to say you don't edit, but like, this conversation is going to get recorded, edited, and put out. With writing, you're like, okay, I've got this. This is our first draft of a paper. But then we have to go and do like another 3 months worth of work to get it, and then clear the gatekeeping, and then do all this other stuff. So I think it's really important. One of the things I'm excited to do is turn that Fast and Furious one into a book. Like, just take all the transcripts, ask AI to clean it up into some writing, and call that a book. Or the case study of Keanu Reeves. That's a whole book unto itself, and we have the first draft. So, my podcasting has been less about traditional academic scholarship, although the Keanu Reeves one is definitely, they get there, but it's more about teaching.
Okay.
And so now my second podcast with Lavelle Anderson out of UIUC is called SNL101. .info, specifically a podcast for educators who want to use Saturday Night Live in the classroom. And so we're constantly talking, like, here's how we would break down these three sketches usually, and here's some readings that we would use in the classroom. And it's a resource for educators, and we do it pretty timely. So I try to get the next one out before Saturday night, so that we're having it in real time, which is very different from my Bob Thompson podcast, which is like, oh, post it when we post it, whatever. But now I'm like trying to be timely and be more broadcasty about it. And it's just, what I love about podcasting is it's an opportunity to engage with critical issues with other scholars without having to edit, grammar, find a publication outlet, dance for the reviewers, revise and resubmit, and all that other stuff. Like, it's the joy of scholarship without the baggage of the game. And so for me, I don't know how when so much of academia is based on the game, How did you publish it? Where did you publish it? How many
Yeah.
citations are you getting? All this other crap. Like, I don't even know who listens to our podcast, okay? I am not good with the metrics. Every so often my husband's like, ooh, how are your metrics going? I'm like, I don't know. I just post it. I have like 3 likes on Instagram. Is that a metric? No, it's not.
Yeah.
Okay. So, for me, it's an opportunity to derive joy from scholarship that is often lost when we have to play the game of scholarship. At the same time, we now have these sites, like, this is where this idea started. Here's the site, here's the date, period. So then that also allows us to be part of the larger, it gives us the metrics that academics require. Okay. So yeah, I'm actually really excited to turn the Fast and Furious and the Keanu Reeves into books and like kind of go for the whole thing. And then, yeah, the SNL is really an educational resource. And I really just need to share that with other educators. That's our, we go niche. I don't want to make an SNL podcast that everyone listens to. But if you want to talk about SNL in the classroom, or if you want to pretend you're in the classroom talking about SNL, you should listen to our podcast.
That's dope. That's dope. Yeah, no. And then I guess the last thing, like I said before, as I've been asking almost everybody that I've talked with, like, what brings them joy in terms of what they consume media wise. And that can be anything. That could be music, that could be TV, that could be film, that could be, I've had individuals say that they're just following certain people on social media. It could be a lot of different realms, but what is something that currently is bringing you joy to consume?
3 things.
Okay.
Pokemon Go. I play a lot of Pokemon Go now. I'm kind of late to the game, but the thing about children's media is that it sucks. And there's so many things that he likes that it's just like, okay, honey, I guess we're gonna go see Paw Patrol live, yay! Like, you try and be supportive, but why do the things they like suck? But Pokemon Go, I've been spending a lot of time on, and then we go as a family. We go on Poke Walks. We it's actually very enjoyable. And then he can be friends with other people because you can't talk. You can just share gifts. So it's kind of a safe space in that front as well on the internet. I watch Saturday Night Live. That's really the only thing I watch regularly. Primarily for work. But that's been literally the only television show that I have consumed on a functionally regular basis for the past 6 years, right? So once the child was born, time goes out the window. And if they're not watching TV, then you don't have time to watch TV. And when they go to sleep, you just want to go to sleep, right? But yeah, Saturday Night Live, I keep up to date on, and also Daily Show. I try to cram some Daily Show. I read the news on my news feed on Twitter. So I have like a special news feed. I hate people who are like, I get my news on Twitter. I'm like, well, do you get that from the New York Times? Do you get that from Andrew Tate? Do you get that from Newsmax? Like, Twitter doesn't make news, okay? Twitter feeds you the news that other people have made. And if you don't know who's making it, you're not very media literate. So I have my special news feed that I scroll, and I know the outlets that are in that list, and that's where I get my news. I don't just open up Twitter and be like, give me news. And I read The Economist, so that's also the only news outlet that we get to our house, because I prefer to read international perspectives on American conversations. And I'll just say, because I like saying this story, I became a subscriber to The Economist in September 2001. Because it was the only outlet that in the wake of 9/11 acknowledged that there was other things happening in the other 100 and 208, 210, the other 200 nations, right? Post 9/11, you remember it was just wall-to-wall coverage. Nothing was changing, right? There was no insight. All there was more names of people that they were pulling from the rubble, which was horrible. But it was just wall-to-wall coverage about the attack. And I'm like, what's happening on every other continent? And so, the format of The Economist was here's what's happening in the Americas, 9/11. Here's what's happening in the US, 9/11. Here's what's happening in China. Here's what's happening in Europe. There's other things continuing to happen. And so I wouldn't say that brings me joy, but it's funny because my 6-year-old is a very good reader. And so now he'll pick up The Economist and ask me questions about it. And I'm like, no, 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 no. Here, you have your highlights magazine. Okay. You leave mommy's magazines alone. But yeah, that's pretty much. Oh, and I always check in on True Facts by Z Frank.
Okay.
Yeah, I would recommend that. True Facts. It is a comedy nature show. And he does like a 10 to 12 minute bit about like 10 to 12 minute videos about different animals. And then it's just like kind of funny. And then brings in like real science. It's a really amazing science biology communication. So if I could recommend one thing outside of my own content, would be True Facts by Z Frank on YouTube.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, this has been a great episode. I can't wait to kind of get back through it, touch upon all the things, and even just laugh at some of the moments that I felt like I wanted to laugh at, but I couldn't.
Also, are you going to NCA in New Orleans?
I don't think I'm going to be able to swing it, only because my dad is sick, and I'm trying to find pockets of time where I can be able to fly back to Chicago. And so I think that period of time, I've been like doing this thing where I'm going back to Chicago at least twice a month, and even if it's just for a few days. And I think I might have to do that because I don't actually have anything that I'm presenting at NCA, because the thing that I submitted wasn't accepted. So
sure. So I will say that I am the lead author on a performance through the Black Caucus. It is Being Black in the Ivory, an interactive experience. And so we are, myself and Sharday Davis, we're inviting Black academics to come together. And we've got a whole interactive experience performance set up, where we could talk about the Black academic experience. Yeah. It includes samples from the book, Being Black in the Ivory, and also, personal anecdotes and engagement. So I will forward you the invite. So if you can't come, that's cool, but do forward it to any other Black academic folks in general. So you can also, there'll be a link there, and you can say, you can go in and like, here are my 5 words I associate with being a Black academic. So you can kind of be in the larger pool. And then also, if you want to share an anecdote or anything that we can read live, so you don't have to be there, but we would love to hear your voice. And then do share it with any other Black academics or, anybody who might be Black at NCA.
For sure. I definitely will. I know some people that'll be out there. So
yeah.
All right. Well, I thank you for your time. This is Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Dr. Jabari Evans. This is Charisse L'Pree, the Incomparable. And that's our episode. Peace.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, leave a rating or review. And to catch the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at KnowledgeSense82 and on Twitter at KnowledgeSense82. Now that's different than how you normally would spell it. That's NALEDGE, Sense 82, as in 1982. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Peace.